Hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Well, the 2025 legislative session is not only over, but we've actually had a chance to crunch some numbers and determine what worked versus what didn't. As I mentioned in the last episode, it was a pretty successful legislative session from the standpoint of if you love freedom, you had a lot to be grateful for. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not room for improvement, but I'll tell you what went right and what we need to work on in just a few moments.
All reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. You know, the legislative session, for some people, they live and breathe. They know the name of every bill. They know exactly what stage it's in, which committee it's going before, if it's waiting to be heard and so forth. They can tell you every step of the process for a lot of us. And I like to think of myself as someone who's paying attention, but there's so many moving parts. It can be really difficult to keep track of. So I want to express my gratitude to all the people out there who, whether in an official capacity or just because they are interested and engaged, have been a part of keeping other people informed. I think that this is one of the big differences that I'm seeing in this compared to at least the last couple of years. It seems like more grassroots effort has been put forth to help people stay motivated, to stay in touch with their legislators. Now, having said that, I want to share with you some thoughts from Idaho Freedom Foundation President Ron Nate. And he does, I think, a wonderful job of breaking this down. Before I go into this, though, I'm going to point out there are a lot of groups and there are a lot of interests and organizations that do their best to help move the needle in a conservative direction. And I think there's plenty of applause to go around for all of them. There's plenty of glory to be shared by those who did their part. But from the standpoint of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, I want to share with you some of the reasons why things went the way they did and some of the tools that you may or may not be aware of that are available to us to help us as we proceed to the 2026 legislative session, even though that's still a little ways off. The preparations start as soon as the old session ends. So I want to share with you IFF's 2025 legislature wrap. And I think you're going to find there's a lot of good food for thought here. Ron Nate, who's the president of IFF, says, first, let's focus on accomplishing the mutual wins for Idaho and IFF. In other words, what was really accomplished that's worth popping some champagne corks? How did the conservative gains happen? Was it just something in the water? Did legislators suddenly become aware of conservative principles, or did we just get lucky? Well, he says luck doesn't just happen. In fact, he says we can identify at least three prominent reasons for the rightward shift. We have better legislators via the 2024 primary and general elections. And boy, is that true. Especially, I look at the Gang of Eight, and I think those were stalwarts who made a difference in so many of the key areas. Number two, Ron says legislators are voting better as seen by Freedom Index scores. Now, if you're not familiar with the Freedom Index, this is something that you can use to not only better your own understanding, but also when it comes time to go cast your vote, it's not going to tell you which legislators to vote for. But if you are serious about freedom and you want to measure, do their actions and their words add up? That Freedom Index will help you see which ones really act in the interest of freedom and which ones will give it lip service long enough to get someone to vote for them and then turn and vote in a totally different direction. Number three, better legislation's being channeled through the chambers while ugly bills are dying in committees or never surfacing to begin with. Now, unfortunately, there are some good bills that died in the chairman's drawer or perhaps died in committee, but let's look at some of these reasons in detail. As far as better legislators, the Idaho Freedom Foundation is a powerhouse in championing freedom and protecting God-given rights in Idaho. In fact, the Freedom Index is the gold standard for citizens and voters to know how their legislators vote on bills and budgets. And this is why those who are, I'm going to use the term rhino, those who pretend to be Republicans, and yes, I adhere to the Republican platform, but whose votes show them to be acting in a very opposite way, they don't like the index because it's right there in black and white, showing what their actions actually belie. And sometimes they are not the conservatives they pretend to be. Ron says in 2024, we distributed close to 40,000 copies of the index. That's more than ever before. Freedom Index scores and grades are often used in campaigns for and against candidates who almost always tout conservative credentials. The index provides proof positive for true conservatives. It's a game changer. Now, I just want to offer this disclaimer because this needs to be said. The Idaho Freedom Foundation, in its official capacity, is not about electing candidates. However, the Freedom Index that it provides to grade those pieces of legislation, as well as track who voted for what, are a very useful tool for those political action committees that actually do work to get candidates elected. And so I just need to make it clear. The Idaho Freedom Foundation isn't going about electing the candidates, but it's giving some great tools to the people who do go about doing that. Now, actually, Ron points this out here. Although IFF doesn't engage in elections, our adjacent organizations, using our research and our analysis, helped achieve fantastic primary and general election results in the last round. And they informed voters of what was going on with Idaho government and their elected leaders. Now, because of these and others' efforts, Idaho enjoyed a net gain of 8 liberty-minded legislators joining the Idaho House and Senate in 2025. And we're confident that those seats translated into positive outcomes in Idaho's legislature. Next, there's the fact of legislators voting better. And again, this comes back to accountability. In 2024, Ron says we introduced the Idaho Freedom Foundation's 2024 Idaho Report on Government Waste. We call it the Pork Report. Years ago, IFF published its first pork report and did another in 2019, but it was time we took another look at waste in the Idaho environment. And the pork report delivered over 60 examples of government waste emanating from Boise and, in fact, all around the state. Now, these examples represent Idahoans' hard-earned tax dollars being frittered away, all because government can't control its spending and has poor incentives for preventing waste, fraud, and abuse. But you can't correct what you don't know about, so this is why it's such an important tool. Knowing how important the Idaho Freedom Index is for election success across Idaho's mostly conservative legislative districts and seeing the examples of waste in Idaho government, the voting in the legislature was much improved this year. For example, we observed 31 legislators scoring A or B Freedom Index grades for their votes on hundreds of rated bills. Last year, only 20 achieved an A or B Freedom grade. So not only did we have more conservative legislators, the voting behavior of the legislature was more conservative to boot. And I'm going to tell you, where you can find that index coming up here in just a few moments. All right, next, there was better legislation. Ron says, let's take a look at the kinds of bills being proposed in the legislature. He says, typically we see a mix of good and bad bills proposed in committees and advanced to the floors of the Senate and House for consideration. Now, this year, there were markedly more conservative bills and fewer stinky bills proposed. It's true this is likely because of an improved composition of the legislature, but it's noteworthy nonetheless. He also says in 2024, 139 bills having at least one floor vote were rated overall, not counting budget bills. Of them, 64 earned positive ratings, which means they positively impact the cause of freedom. And there's a whole metric that you can run through. Does it increase the size and accountability of government, or does it decrease that? Does it put a burden on taxpayers, or does it decrease it? And this year there was also an added aspect of, does it contribute to upholding the traditional family values, which it turns out that's a really good metric to have added in there. The average rating of a bill in 2024 was a minus 0.13. But this year, the legislature in 2025 voted on 178 rated bills, 87 positive bills, 64 negative bills, and 27 neutral bills. So the average rating was a positive 0.16. So you can see the composition of the bills offered was markedly better this year for getting conservative results. Better legislators, meaning more conservatives, combined with legislators voting better, improved performance, and a better mix of bills to consider, fewer bad bill proposals, all worked to make 2025 one of the more successful conservative shifts in Idaho's recent history. Ron says, we applaud the conservative legislators who helped to make it happen, and we urge the rest to read the room and improve their voting. Idaho is on a conservative path, similar to the U.S. trend under President Trump. And legislators would be wise to lead conservative, follow conservative, or just get out of the way. I think we're probably going to see some changes in the next primary due to some of those aforementioned legislators who pretend to be Republican but don't seem to vote like Republicans. Overall, Ron says, the 2025 legislature did awesome things. School choice was finally passed, welfare for illegals was abolished, DEI in higher education was completely eliminated, robust health freedom protection was approved, far-left organizations are prohibited from introducing drug legalizing ballot initiatives pending the approval of HJR 4, and there was significant tax relief, mostly on the income tax front. Now, budgets grew too, but at least the growth was slower than it has been. And as far as some of those losses, there was the failure to repeal the grocery tax, a failure to hold Medicaid expansion fully accountable, a failure to repeal the launch program, and yet again, the budget continued to grow even after years of government bloat. But I think most of us would agree this is a real step in the right direction. Now we just have to keep up the momentum, because I promise you, the people who want to enact anti-freedom agenda items are still going to be very much at work. Now, the 2025 Idaho Freedom and Family Agenda was a big part of the focus of the Idaho Freedom Foundation this year, and it included the following policy priorities. Pay close attention, because you're going to see how many of these were enacted. Universal education choice. They got it at least in part. Grocery tax repeal and property tax relief. Didn't get the grocery tax, but there was relief. There was some tax relief. Eliminate DEI and wokeness in education. Okay, that one was a solid yes. Address illegal immigration. Again, a good start with the denying welfare benefits for people who are in the country illegally or in the state illegally. Advancing sound money, spending less, and spending responsibly. Not bad. You'll see that most of those actually saw some level of success, but Ron says we still have work to do to inform the public and the legislature on the problems with some taxes and policy. For example, the House Revenue and Taxation Committee blocked a hearing for H-260, which would have eliminated the grocery tax. Bill H-83, which would have blocked illegal entry by foreign nationals, was watered down to near effectiveness in order to please special interests such as the Idaho Dairymen's Association and food producers of Idaho. And this is one of the things when I say that, the people who work against freedom, it's not that they're not, hardcore commies necessarily. Sometimes it's just special interests who are trying to carve out certain government afforded protections for themselves. But those protections come at the expense of the taxpayer, at least in the case of, having illegals in the state, particularly wanting them to have benefits or have otherwise protections that they don't deserve. So Ron says we need to keep working toward repealing taxes, promoting sound money, defending against illegal immigration, and fixing our bloated budgets. But that doesn't diminish the big wins in those areas. So looking ahead to 2026, conservatives should be focusing on rallying together to fight against powerful lobbying groups like Big Ag, Big Pharma, the Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry, which you'll hear referred to as IACI, the Idaho Education Association, and all the lawmakers and bureaucrats who carry water for them. We must make conservative strides in these important policy arenas. So now let me introduce you to a couple of the tools that will help you if you want to be a part of that effort. First is the Idaho Index. And look at this. We are covering freedom, spending, education. You can go to index.idahofreedom.org and you will find so much great information. And again, this is based not on personalities, but based on actual principles. Does it increase or does it decrease liberty? That is the real measure. And of course, there are some legislators who don't really like this, because when their efforts are shown as to what their actions actually betray, they don't appear in a very flattering light. Also, there's the Idaho Freedom and Family Agenda. And this is not something that stops because, we got some good wins in 2025. These are some good baseline principles and foundational principles on which we can move forward into the coming year, as well as the legislative session for 2026. So hold your head high if you are on Team Freedom. I know that sometimes we see infighting, and it's curious to me. This has been the case for as long as I can remember. Conservatives have a tendency sometimes to snipe at their own, and I don't understand exactly what that is. Sometimes it's just personality conflicts or so forth. But if we can look at it as, are you on the side of Team Freedom and pull together? I think we are definitely on a good path, and we have some wonderful wins to celebrate. Now let's keep the momentum going as we move through the rest of 2025 and toward another legislative session in 2026. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
All reporters are biased. The Idaho Press Club are biased. All media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see